What would you do if a police officer stopped you on the street just because you were you, just because of the way you walk, the clothes you wear, and the gift you carry in your hand? A confrontation that seems harmless could turn into a storm, one in which an entire community must rise up and speak out. But not everyone realizes that this woman is not just an ordinary anonymous person. Who is she? What has she done to push this chaotic system to the edge? You won't be able to guess the outcome because what's about to happen will change everything in an instant. Let us know where you're hearing this story from and what time it is right now. Do you think you understand everything about justice and power? Prepare yourself because this story will make you reconsider everything you think you know. It all begins on a beautiful morning like any other where a woman walks through peaceful streets. But there are things that can never be considered peaceful when you are judged just because of the color of your skin. Chapter. Have you ever felt that you were perceived differently just because of the way you walk, the clothes you wear, or simply the color of your skin? Today's story isn't just about a brief encounter on a street, but about how justice is perceived and executed in today's world. Can something as seemingly harmless as walking down the street make you a victim of discrimination? Let this story open up bigger questions for those who dare to face justice. On a morning in Atlanta, everything was as calm as any other day. The summer heat was beginning to creep into the streets, but it was still cool enough to feel the breath of spring passing by. Bicycles circled the corners, children played under the trees, and the laughter of the elderly on park benches filled the air, adding to the serene atmosphere. Susan Johnson, a 56-year-old woman, was part of that peaceful scene. She walked down Main Street in Atlanta, her feet gently tapping on the cobblestone, the sound of her shoes rhythmically echoing like the pace of life she had known for so many years. Susan was no stranger to this city. She had grown up here, witnessing its changes, its ups and downs through the years, but perhaps she never imagined that today her life would change forever. With her dark brown hair touched with strands of silver and delicate pearl jewelry, Susan had a soft yet captivating beauty. The cream-colored evening gown she wore today was a special gift from David, her husband, the head of the city police force, in celebration of their 25th wedding anniversary. Every year, she wore this gown on significant occasions to remember the sweet memories of their married life. She stopped in front of a secondhand bookstore where the dust-covered books always beckoned those who sought quiet solace. She picked up a thick book, carefully flipping through its pages as if savoring the essence of the old words. At that moment, Susan's heart thought of nothing beyond the simple joys of daily life, the quiet pleasures of early autumn days. She lifted her eyes and glanced at the people passing by, couples holding hands, children laughing and playing on the street in the fresh air that made everything seem peaceful, as if nothing could disturb the calm. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on a police car parked not far away near the cafe she often visited. She didn't pay much attention to it. It was just an ordinary police car. She knew that officers often parked here to take breaks or handle simple situations. But this time, something felt different. A sense of being watched made Susan feel slightly uneasy. Naturally, she continued walking her steps leisurely, not at all concerned about the police car. But just as she was about to turn a corner, a man's voice called out from behind, sharp and firm. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you please stop for a moment?" Susan startled, turning around. Standing before her was a police officer, a young man, his face tense and his demeanor stiff. He didn't smile as most officers she had met before did. Instead, his eyes were filled with suspicion, and the smile had completely vanished from his face. At first, she thought it was just a routine situation, an officer checking papers for some reason, but his gaze remained fixed on her as if he was examining her from the inside out. "Hello, is there something wrong?" Susan asked softly, but without avoiding the confrontation. "It seems like you're doing something unusual," he said, his eyes lingering on the dress she wore, then moving to the gleaming pearl necklace around her neck. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Susan was a little surprised. "I'm just taking a walk and buying a book. You can check my papers if you need to." But then an unexpected question came from the young officer. "Can I see your papers? This pearl necklace looks too expensive for a woman like you." His words felt like slaps in the air, not just because of the surprise, but because of the way he judged her as if she didn't deserve to be here. The atmosphere around her suddenly felt thick, and Susan felt a tightness in her chest. Everything no longer seemed as simple as it had been moments ago. "This necklace is a gift from my husband. He's an important person here," Susan replied, trying to remain calm. Her husband, David Johnson, was the police chief of the city, but she didn't think she needed to mention that. Yet seeing the officer's rigid attitude, she felt she couldn't just let this situation pass. The officer didn't back down. He kept encroaching on her personal space. His questions about personal belongings and the appropriateness of the necklace seemed endless. It was as if she were a criminal who had to prove her innocence. At this point, Susan realized that this encounter was no ordinary routine check. She was no longer just an ordinary woman. Now she was facing a challenge she couldn't have anticipated. But what Susan didn't know was that what was happening wouldn't stop there. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would change. And this man, the officer with the suspicious gaze, had no idea who she was. She wasn't just a wife, she was the wife of the head of the city's police force. A confrontation that seemed small was about to open up a storm no one could foresee. She straightened up, looked the young officer directly in the eyes, and firmly responded, "I haven't committed any crime, and I'm not someone who needs to explain myself to you." The early morning atmosphere of Atlanta slowly began to shift as Officer Mark Adams sat in the police car parked on the side of the road. The familiar sounds of the quiet city faded, leaving only the ticking of the clock in the car, as if counting down to an event he couldn't predict. Mark wasn't the type to judge people hastily. However, from the moment his gaze fell on Susan, he felt something was off. Susan, the woman walking down Main Street dressed elegantly in a cream-colored dress and sparkling pearl jewelry, had caught his attention the moment she stepped out of the bookstore. He couldn't help but wonder, why was a woman like her, beautiful, well-dressed, and composed, walking alone on the street in the morning, holding such a precious gift? In a city like Atlanta, with its ethnic diversity, there were very few women with her kind of elegance, walking alone on the street while everyone else hurried about their business and lives. Adams felt an inexplicable discomfort, not because of anything she had done, but because of the difference between her and the people he usually encountered in his work. This feeling of unease wasn't hatred, but an unrecognized anxiety, as if something was happening that was beyond his control. He couldn't stop the random questions popping up in his mind. Who is she? Why is she walking alone? And what about that pearl necklace? It seems too expensive for someone like her, doesn't it? These questions began to cling to his thoughts, impossible to shake off, impossible to explain. And then he made a decision. He couldn't just let it pass as a coincidence. He stepped out of the car, giving himself the right to determine what was happening. Little did he know that this action would lead to unforeseen consequences. As he stepped out of the police car, his stride was heavier than usual. He couldn't understand why a woman like Susan made him feel uneasy. The people he usually met on this street were workers rushing through their day, people who never seemed drawn to luxury people living in a world he could predict. But Susan was different. She seemed to be someone outside of the ordinary world he knew. As he approached Susan, she didn't alter her pace, didn't step back, nor show any sign of unease. This only made Mark feel more like an outsider, as if he didn't belong in her world. To regain control of the situation, he decided to call out to her. His voice was not that of a polite request, but one filled with demand, a demand full of suspicion. "I need you to stop for a moment." His voice was commanding. It wasn't a question, but a demand. And Susan, the calm woman, never in a rush, turned around to face him, her eyes devoid of fear. She simply asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" He stared at her, his gaze inspecting her from the elegant evening gown to the sparkling pearl necklace around her neck, as if these items were telling a story he couldn't understand. He wondered, was it her appearance that made him feel uneasy? Was she someone he had never encountered before? And what had she done to attract such attention? "Your necklace, it looks quite expensive. Could you tell me where you bought it?" Mark asked, his eyes still fixed on the necklace. Susan didn't change her expression. "It's a gift from my husband. We've been married for over 20 years, she replied, maintaining her composure. "Who is your husband?" he continued, his gaze still locked on her. This question was clearly not a casual inquiry. Mark Adams wasn't just asking about the necklace. He seemed to be asking a bigger question. One about the appropriateness of a woman like Susan in this space. Susan didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, sensing the tension in the air, but feeling no fear. In truth, she had faced more difficult situations throughout her life. But today the officer's frustration made her think. He wasn't just asking about the necklace. He was formulating questions in his mind, questions about her suitability, about her place in society. Slowly she responded, "My husband is David Johnson, the police chief of this city. Mark Adams' eyes seemed to light up, but not with recognition or respect. His gaze shifted almost as if moving from suspicion to an unclear judgment. He didn't know if this was the truth, but in that moment a thought flashed through his mind. She's the wife of the head of the police force, and yet she's being suspected. Did I make a mistake? Mark's suspicious look was no longer the same as before. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was a lack of confidence. Everything seemed to be starting to shift, but it couldn't be undone. At this moment in the streets of Atlanta, an unexpected confrontation was beginning to unfold. Susan, the elegant woman wife of the city's police chief, was not the kind of person Mark could easily suspect. But it was in this moment that everything began to slip beyond his control. The air on the streets of Atlanta grew heavy. Adams walked closer, each step stiff as if he were preparing for a confrontation with someone he couldn't ignore. His eyes landed on the pearl necklace Susan wore, then shifted to the precious gift in her hand, further fueling his suspicion. Surely a woman like her, well-dressed and composed, couldn't be just an ordinary person. He didn't know why, but in his mind, a series of strange questions began to surface about the expensive pearl necklace, about the precious gift in her hand, and about why she was walking alone on this quiet morning. These are valuable items. Could you tell me where you bought them? Adams asked, his voice trying to sound authoritative and stern, but it couldn't conceal the tension that radiated from his eyes and body. Susan, with a calm demeanor, showed no sign of panic or anxiety. She stood straight, her hand still firmly holding the precious gift. Her gaze held no fear, just the calmness of someone who had faced many challenges in life. She answered simply yet powerfully, "These are gifts from my husband." Adams didn't stop there. He couldn't easily let go of the suspicion swirling in his mind. Susan's appearance didn't fit what he was used to. This woman, with her elegant attire and calm demeanor, made him feel uncomfortable. Something about her made him continue his inquiry to create doubt. Unnecessary questions followed, and he demanded to see her identification as though it were a normal procedure. "We need to check if you have identification." Adams said, his voice cold, as though giving an order. Susan, unshaken, looked him directly in the eyes and responded decisively. "Is there a reason I need to show my identification?" Her words were a reminder of personal freedom, but Adams refused to back down. He felt frustrated because she wasn't showing fear, wasn't submitting to the control he wanted. That made him feel even more challenged. His gaze now carried more than suspicion. It was tinged with growing anger. This feeling quickly spread, and the crowd around began to notice the situation. Passers-by started to stop watching the officer's every move and the woman standing opposite him. Everything seemed to turn into a public standoff. Some people began pulling out their phones, preparing to capture the moment, while others simply stood still, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Adams didn't think this was unusual. He simply thought it was another stop, another routine check like so many others. But for Susan, this was no ordinary situation. She could feel the distinct difference in the way this officer was looking at her, the way he was treating her. And she understood that this wasn't just about the necklace or the gift in her hand. It was a bigger story, a story about discrimination, about control, and about power. "This isn't how we treat people in this city," Susan said, her voice calm but firm, unwavering. She didn't let go of the gift in her hand, but continued to look at him. "Do you have the right to ask for my identification? Do you have any evidence to make me stop?" Susan's questions were a gentle but sharp challenge. They weren't just a protest. They were a declaration of her personal rights, and Adams couldn't refute her, and the tension between the two grew even sharper. Adams began to feel the awkwardness increasing, and at that moment he realized that the situation had spiraled out of his control. The crowd around them had become a curious audience. Eyes were watching from a distance, scrutinizing glances, and phones were now recording every second of the confrontation. What Adams didn't realize was that this wasn't just a simple document check anymore. It had become a conflict about power, respect, and opposition. A few people in the crowd began whispering to each other. Questions floated in the air. Did she do something wrong? Why is she being stopped? She's just walking. Why stop her like this? These questions quickly spread, and in front of the crowd, the situation seemed to go beyond a personal matter. It had become something much bigger, a matter of justice, human rights, and how those in power can abuse that power. The discomfort in Adams' eyes deepened. He couldn't stop thinking about the question Susan had just asked. Was there any reason for him to demand her identification? Or was it simply because she was a woman who appeared different, someone who didn't fit his expectations? Susan, still calm, didn't speak further. She knew that things had gone too far, but she also knew that at this moment she couldn't back down. She couldn't allow control and suspicion to persist. Because if she conceded, if she allowed him to win, then not just her, but everyone else would suffer the same treatment. In the future, Adam's gaze was no longer just suspicion. It was uncertainty, a failure to maintain control, confusion in front of a woman standing firm in her conviction. The crowd now wasn't just watching. They were beginning to sense a shift. This wasn't a simple fight between a police officer and a woman. It was a battle between justice and oppression. Finally, Adams couldn't maintain his facade of authority. Under the eyes of the crowd, the truth began to spill out, and there was no turning back. The video of the tense confrontation between Susan and Officer Adams quickly spread across social media platforms. What began as a simple moment, a strange conversation on the street, rapidly transformed into a media storm. People from everywhere began following, sharing, and commenting. In just one night, Susan's story went from a personal event to a massive social phenomenon. The crowd around Susan, those witnessing it, and those who would later watch the video, couldn't help but feel the power in the way she faced the officer, as she not only defended her personal rights, but stood up against the subtle racism. Though she was an ordinary woman, Susan suddenly became a living symbol of the fight against the abuse of power in society. Not long after protests erupted, not just in Atlanta, but in many other major cities, slogans like "Justice for Susan," "Justice for all" rang out everywhere. Each protest saw people from all walks of life, ethnicities and professions, from young students to older women, from workers to civil rights activists, all stood up in support of Susan and what she represented. Since the video went public, everything in Susan's life changed rapidly. Initially, she thought of it as a personal event, a fleeting moment in life that she never sought attention for. But now she was not just a victim of discrimination. She had become the face of a much larger movement. This movement wasn't just about seeking justice for her, but a broader struggle confronting racism and social injustice. As she realized the extent of her influence, Susan felt the weight of responsibility. She couldn't step back. Her supporters weren't just looking at her as an oppressed woman. They were seeing her as a warrior standing in the midst of a great battle, a battle for equality and justice. She realized that from now on, she wasn't fighting just for herself, but for all those who couldn't stand up and speak the truth. Despite the growing protests and increasing support, Susan didn't feel pride or joy over the attention. In fact, she felt a bit anxious because this wasn't a personal victory. It was the victory of a movement she never expected. She had gone from being an ordinary woman to a symbol. And in these moments, as her influence spread, she began to feel the weight of the mission she now had to carry. Still, she remained resolute. Susan understood that this movement wasn't just about creating change for those living in the present, but would affect future generations as well. What she was doing today would lay the groundwork for those who would stand up against discrimination and injustice in the future. Indeed, Susan was no longer just a victim of a singular event. She had become a role model for anyone who had been oppressed, for anyone who had felt voiceless in society. Her strength was not only in standing up for her personal rights, but also in fighting for a just society free of discrimination. She had become a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to be subdued by forces of power, no matter the challenges she faced. With the rise of the protests and campaigns supporting Susan, she realized that what she was doing wasn't just about changing a few things in a neighborhood or a small city. She was changing an entire system, one where people of color, the oppressed, could finally feel that they would be protected, that they could speak the truth without fear of being bullied or oppressed. The protests were relentless, a wave of demands for justice spreading across the country. The protesters, the supporters of Susan, realized that this was not just one person's fight, but the fight of an entire community. And Susan, the 56-year-old woman, mother and wife, was now not just the mother of a family, but the mother of a movement, fighting for freedom and justice for all. Susan now understood that she had not only been fighting for her own rights, she had become the first to step forward, to stand up, and to challenge a system that had existed for so long, a system that had long silenced voices like hers. She had become a symbol of resilience and justice in an era where standing up against injustice could change the world. In those moments, a new awareness began to form within her, an awareness not only about the injustice, but also about the power of community. These protests were no longer just a reaction against a wrong action. They were a connection between like-minded people united by a common dream for an equal, non-discriminatory society. And as soon as she realized that she was not alone, that she had become an inspiration for so many, Susan knew she had to continue. She had to keep going, not just for herself, but for the millions of others who needed her to fight for them. After the tense incident on the streets of Atlanta, when Susan's video went viral, David Johnson, her husband, could not sit idly by. As the head of the city's police force, he knew his responsibility went beyond just protecting the citizens of the city. It was also about protecting justice, especially when his own force was being criticized. He couldn't allow an officer to abuse his power without consequence. So David decided to call for a full investigation into the actions of Officer Mark Adams. This decision was a shock to David himself. As the head of the police force, he knew well the risks and potential consequences of taking on one of his own officers. However, David did not hesitate. He understood that Adams' actions weren't just a personal mistake. They were part of a much larger system, a system where police power could be abused without oversight. Failing to act would make him part of the problem rather than a solution to it. David called for an internal investigation, not only into Adams, but into any other misconduct within the department. A thorough investigation leaving no sign of injustice unchecked. This was an opportunity to cleanse the entire police force of the city, a force that had allowed racism and abuses of power to persist. The investigation quickly uncovered serious misconduct in Adams's actions. However, what surprised David and the investigators even more was how the network of wrongdoing went much deeper than anticipated. Abuse of power, illegal traffic stops, racial discrimination. These actions were all part of a system David now had to confront. He understood that if this system wasn't cleaned up, Susan's fight for justice would only be a short-term victory. While the investigation within the police force was ongoing, civil rights organizations were no longer staying on the sidelines. They began to approach Susan not only to support her in this fight, but to help her reclaim justice for all the oppressed people in society. Organizations like Black Lives Matter, feminist groups, and other civil rights groups began to come together, building a strong campaign, demanding change. Lawyers and civil rights activists spoke out calling for police reform and demanding transparency in every action taken by officers. Protests continued to erupt, not only in Atlanta, but across many other cities. Nationwide, calls for justice for Susan and for those affected by racial discrimination rang louder than ever. Susan, even though she had become a symbol of the movement, didn't stop fighting. She attended meetings with civil rights organizations, shared her story, and stood up for those who had no voice. But she also had to face other attacks from those opposed to the movement. Criticisms and accusations began to emerge, claiming that she was exploiting the attention for personal gain. Those critics didn't understand that what she was doing wasn't for herself, it was for a much larger cause, the cause of justice and equality. Despite facing these attacks, Susan did not back down. She had proven that she was strong enough to stand firm in this battle, and she continued to call for change. With the support of David and civil rights organizations, she was not only fighting for her own justice, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. This fight was not just against bad individuals, but against an entire system that had long existed and needed to change. At this point, the investigation into Adams continued to expand. His actions weren't just the actions of an individual. They reflected a deeper issue of inadequate training and oversight within the police force. Some other officers who had once defended Adams began to come forward with revelations about past misconduct. A few began to feel they could finally speak out, even though they had remained silent for so long. But shedding light on the issue wasn't just about blaming individuals. It was about demanding change across the entire police system. Susan's supporters were not just individuals, they had become part of a larger growing movement. Her story had touched the hearts of millions, not only those who had been oppressed, but also those who wanted to change the system. Susan, from an ordinary woman, had become the spiritual leader of a movement demanding justice. Susan's fight was no longer just her personal battle. It had become a fight for a fairer future where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or social status, could live in respect and equality. The protests were not only for justice for Susan, but for a wide-reaching change in society, starting with the police force. And while David's investigation continued, Susan knew that this battle wouldn't stop at an investigation or a protest. It was a long-term fight requiring perseverance and courage. But Susan was ready to continue, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. David Johnson's investigation as the head of the Atlanta Police Department did not stop at examining Officer Mark Adams' actions. What began as a simple investigation quickly revealed dark secrets and misconducts that the police system had hidden and tolerated for years. The deeper David and Susan dug, the more they uncovered a complex picture, one where power was abused and where officers could easily cross legal boundaries without facing any punishment. The investigation not only exposed Adams' behavior, but also highlighted the shortcomings in the oversight, management, and training of police officers over the years. Similar incidents weren't rare, but rather a part of a system built around silence and mutual protection among officers. Officers, despite knowing their colleagues' wrongdoing, chose to stay silent out of fear of losing power or facing their peers. David felt as if he was standing in front of a concrete wall. Every step forward revealed a new secret, and the people at the top, the ones responsible for overseeing and running the police force, were the very ones who had enabled the wrongdoing. David knew that if he wanted to change the system, he needed to do more than just hold officers like Adams accountable. He had to confront an entire network of power that had existed too long within the police force. Susan, despite the difficulties and pain from her own struggle, could not stop fighting for real change. She realized that this battle wasn't just for her, but for everyone who had been or still was oppressed by an unjust system. She and David were determined to dismantle not just one individual, but the entire structure that had protected abuses of power for years. The protests continued, not just in Atlanta, but across major cities. Nationwide, Susan's story had become a symbol for the fight against racism and the abuse of power within the police system. The crowds were not only fighting for justice for Susan, but also for a more transparent and just police system. The chants that echoed through the protests demanded not only justice, but also comprehensive reform, one where every citizen, regardless of race, skin color, or social status, would be protected and treated equally. From the initial protests, the demand for reform grew into a massive movement, one that included not only those who had been racially discriminated against, but also white people, civil rights organizations, and feminist groups. Calls for comprehensive police reform were raised, including improving police training programs, increasing oversight and transparency in investigations, and establishing independent civilian oversight bodies to ensure every officer would be held accountable for their actions. The calls for change were no longer confined to street protests. They began to echo through legislative halls, where politicians started to listen and propose reform measures. Civil rights organizations and activists ramped up their strategies, calling for systemic reforms, not just within the police force, but also within the entire criminal justice system. However, opposition to reform continued. Critics of police reform began speaking out, arguing that the protests were unnecessary and were only distracting from other important issues. Some even accused Susan and her civil rights organizations of being agitators, trying to leverage the attention for political gain. But these criticisms couldn't shake Susan's resolve nor the commitment of those fighting alongside her. She understood that this was a fight not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly in society. She knew this battle wasn't just about her personal struggle, but it was a fight for all those who had been marginalized, silenced, or oppressed. It was a fight for justice, equality, and the rights of every individual to be treated with dignity. Despite the opposition, Susan remained steadfast, unwavering in her belief that true change could only come through standing up against an unjust system, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. The protests had become an integral part of the urban landscape, with civil rights organizations holding meetings, speeches, and panels to discuss the necessary reforms. Activists were using social media to connect and organize campaigns, calling on those who couldn't participate in the protests to join the movement. Each chant of justice for Susan wasn't just a call for personal justice, but for a comprehensive transformation in the police system and society as a whole. Susan and David, along with their allies, knew they were at the heart of a revolution that was not only about justice for one person, but about changing an entire system that had shielded wrongful acts for years. Despite facing tremendous challenges, they did not back down. They understood that this fight would not end until everyone was treated fairly and equally. While the fight raged on, change began to take shape. Small but steady steps were chipping away at the walls that protected power and injustice. Civil rights organizations were stronger than ever, and the movement for police reform had become a nationwide cause. Change was coming, and though slow, it could not be stopped. After the heated protests and the loud calls for reform from the community, Susan and David Johnson, with the continuous support of civil rights organizations and social activists, persisted in their mission. They knew that this fight was not only for Susan's justice, but for everyone oppressed and discriminated against in society. However, the path they had chosen was not smooth, and every effort was tested by powerful opposition from within the police force and conservative forces in the community. David, as the head of the city's police department, had to face growing opposition from his own colleagues in the industry. Veteran officers who had been in the job for years and were accustomed to the current system of power were not quick to accept the changes that David and Susan were pushing for. Some felt threatened by these reforms, believing they would weaken police authority and give criminals the chance to evade justice. Secret meetings and tense discussions in police headquarters became the setting for mounting criticism and pressure on the Johnson family. Despite the pressure from within his own profession, David did not falter. He knew that significant change couldn't come without bold and decisive steps. He and Susan had already planned proposals for reform, including the establishment of an independent oversight body for police activities requiring transparency in police misconduct reports and enhancing police training on civil rights and racial issues. These were crucial changes that would ensure misconduct was no longer hidden and that officers would be held accountable for their actions. However, these proposals were not only David and Susan's goals, they were a direct challenge to the traditional values that had been entrenched in the police force for decades. Some leaders within the police believed these reforms would cause them to lose control and undermine the relationship between the police and the community. They accused Susan and David of abusing their power to advance a political campaign without regard for societal stability. At this point, Susan was no longer just David's wife. She had become a symbol of the movement for justice for all those who had been racially discriminated against and oppressed. Protests and calls for reform continued to spread across the country. Calls for transparency and accountability in the police force echoed throughout society, from the streets of Atlanta to major cities across the United States. Susan knew that for real change to occur, it wasn't enough to have large protests or media campaigns. The most important step was to build a solid foundation from the community where everyone could participate in this fight. Meetings and conferences were held continuously, and in each discussion, the reform proposals of Susan and David became clearer. They proposed an independent oversight mechanism to ensure every police officer's actions were checked and evaluated objectively. Complaints from citizens needed to be made public to prevent concealment or neglect of misconduct. The retraining of police officers on human rights principles and justice was also seen as an essential measure to help officers understand their responsibility to the community. Although these proposals received strong support from civil rights organizations and a large portion of the public, many others, including influential figures within the police force, vehemently opposed them. They argued that these reforms would weaken the stability and rapid responsibility of the police force during emergency situations. Some even argued that making complaints public would tarnish the police's credibility, making it harder for them to carry out their duties effectively. Despite facing strong opposition, Susan and David remained undeterred. They understood that this fight wasn't easy, but once they had started, they wouldn't turn back. What they were fighting for was not just their own rights, but the rights of the entire community. They knew that changing the police system wasn't a short-term task, but a long and difficult process requiring perseverance, community support, and a clear strategy. Together with civil rights organizations, Susan and David held meetings with lawmakers urging them to create new policies and laws to ensure law enforcement agencies would no longer protect wrongful acts. Lobbying sessions and official meetings became opportunities for them to convey the message of necessary change and build community support. Though the challenges and obstacles were unrelenting, they knew that these changes wouldn't just improve the police force, but also benefit the community, helping to create a more just and transparent society where everyone would be treated equally under the law. Their struggle had never been easy, but every step forward brought them closer to a future where justice would truly be served. After relentless efforts, Susan and David witnessed significant changes in the police force, reforms they had long fought for now becoming a reality. But their victory wasn't limited to changing a system. It sparked a wave of transformation that reached across major cities nationwide. Susan and David's story was no longer just a personal struggle. It had become the fight for millions of people who had been oppressed, discriminated against, and ignored in society. The police reforms had begun to be implemented. But more importantly, the principles they set forth were widely embraced. Independent oversight bodies were established to monitor police actions, requiring the public release of complaints and building a more transparent system to protect citizens' rights. Though these measures couldn't completely eliminate all wrongdoings, They laid the foundation for fairness and the protection of the community's interests. Susan and David's story had not only become a symbol of resilience and determination, but also an inspiration for many. From community workshops to political meetings, people turned to their story as an example of the power of standing up in the face of oppression and injustice. They showed that even as an ordinary woman, if you believe in justice and dare to stand up, you can change an entire system. The recognition of Susan and David's struggle didn't just come from civil rights organizations, it spread to different communities around the world. Their story was shared far and wide, not only in the United States, but in other countries where issues of racism and injustice were still deeply felt. Protests around the world began to emerge, inspired by their story, providing a powerful source of motivation for those suffering from oppression. One morning, as Susan and David attended an international human rights conference, they were greeted as heroes of the movement. Journalists, activists, and international organizations gathered to hear their story. They were no longer just the head of the police force and the family of a powerful official. They had become role models for tireless struggle for justice. "We are not fighting for fame or personal gain," Susan said in a live interview. "We fight for all those who have been and are being treated unjustly, for those who have no voice. That's why we continue to stand firm, continue to fight." It was their sincerity and determination that created a wave of change. Civil rights organizations began proposing even more powerful reform plans. People from all communities, whether black or white, from ordinary neighborhoods to those hardest hit by racism, united in a call for change. The change didn't just happen within the police system, it spread across all sectors of society. Schools, hospitals, and public organizations began to recognize racial issues and implement policies to protect the rights of minority groups. Dialogue between communities and government agencies became increasingly open as people realized that only by working together could society change. While Susan and David's story continued to spread, they didn't forget that the road ahead was still long and full of challenges. Reforms had not yet fully taken hold, and obstacles continued to emerge. But with constant support from the community and those aligned with their cause, they believed that every step they took was part of the global fight for a more just society. "We may change a system, but what's most important is to maintain faith in justice," David shared during a meeting. "That's why we never give up, and we hope our story will inspire others to stand up as well." Susan and David's story was no longer just a personal struggle. It had become a symbol of persistence, unity, and hope. They were not only a wife and a husband, but leaders of a global movement calling for justice and change. And although the fight had never been easy, they knew that only when everyone stands up and fights together could real change happen. They proved one undeniable truth. Change doesn't just begin with those in power. It begins with those who dare to stand up and say no to injustice, no matter who they are or where they come from. Their story had become a global one, a symbol of the unyielding struggle for justice and a reminder that justice is not a moment, it is an ongoing battle. When Susan and David's tireless efforts reached their peak, they didn't just achieve a personal victory, they sparked a true revolution. The movement they created wasn't just a fight for justice for one woman, it became a symbol for all who had been oppressed and discriminated against. Their story became the collective voice of millions, a powerful call for change in society. In the days following the confrontation between Susan and Officer Adams, when the event had spread widely on social media, the demand for justice continued to draw more people into the movement. Major protests erupted not just in Atlanta, but across other major cities in the U.S. Slogans like "Justice for Susan" and "End Racism" in the police force rang out forcefully. People no longer hesitated to stand up for the basic rights they should have been protected. Susan and David weren't just fighting for themselves. They became the embodiment of the fight for an entire community. They began to realize that change couldn't come from one individual alone, but had to be the result of a strong movement fueled by the unity of all the oppressed and unjustly treated. Most of those joining the movement weren't doing so because of a simple confrontation between a woman and an officer. They joined because of the fight for justice, because they saw in Susan's story the injustice they had endured. They joined because they understood that if no one stood up, nothing would ever change. And in the end, they realized that the efforts of one person, when joined together, could create an unexpected and profound transformation. One of the most notable changes was the shift in how the community viewed and interacted with the police force. Despite resistance from within the police, the movement had strongly influenced conservative views, sparking important conversations on how to reform the police system. Community meetings were held in neighborhoods where residents and police officers engaged in direct dialogues to rebuild trust and respect. The reforms began to be implemented at the city level, then spread nationwide. Measures like independent oversight of the police force, public disclosure of complaint reports, and mandatory training for police officers on handling situations and emotional management were put into practice in many areas. These changes were not the end of the struggle. They were just the beginning of a truly just system, one that is fairer for everyone. This movement didn't only bring change to the police system, but it also impacted other societal organizations, educational institutions, and healthcare facilities. Dialogues between oppressed community groups and organizations. Businesses began to take place more frequently, discussing ways to address discrimination and promote inclusion. The change was not only seen through policies, but also in the transformation of individuals within the community. People began to understand their rights and were ready to stand up when those rights were violated. Civil rights organizations grew even stronger, not just in fighting for the rights of the oppressed, but also in creating mechanisms to protect those who speak out for justice. Susan and David's story became a symbol of resilience and determination, not only in Atlanta, but across the globe. People from various countries who might be facing similar issues of racism began to look to this movement as inspiration to rise up and fight for their rights. Susan and David proved that despite the challenging nature of the fight, if you don't give up, you can change the world. The movement had become a true revolution, not only changing how government agencies operated, but also rekindling hope in those who were oppressed. It reminded everyone that change cannot come easily, but with persistence, courage, and unity, a fair justice system for all is completely achievable. Susan and David's story didn't end here. It opened a new chapter, one full of hope and commitment for a more just future where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, has the right to live in a society that respects their dignity and rights. As this movement continued to grow, its power would never be extinguished because justice will always be an ongoing fight. Justice is not a moment. It is an unending battle, and it is a battle we must engage in. The fight is not always easy, but as Susan and David's story demonstrates, every courageous act can create a wave of change. It serves as a powerful reminder that we cannot remain silent in the face of injustice. And when we all stand together, change will come. If this story has inspired you, don't forget to hit like and share this video with your friends so that together we can make a difference. Let's raise our voices for justice. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more touching and meaningful stories like this one. Together we can achieve miracles.